halfway up, then this may buckle like that, whereas this one buckles like that, and it may not be immediately apparent which one's worse. Which one's worse will be the one that gives you the biggest slenderness ratio at the end of the day. So slenderness ratio is based on... Sorry?
We haven't covered intermediate propping, have we?
Sorry?
We don't have to cover about the intermediate propping.
Well, if there's an intermediate prop, I will tell you that it's there, because of course the worked example in the notes has got an intermediate prop, for example. I won't ask you to find out what the force in the prop is or anything like that. But if I tell you there's a prop there, then it's a toss-up between, do I base the slenderness on that? That's RZ, and that's, if you like, LZ. Or do I base it on that? And that's LY. So you just work both out and see which you thought was critical. We used to have guidance in the older British codes about what that, just out of interest, although I won't come in the exam, about what that propping force ought to be. The Eurocode doesn't give you any indication at all, it just assumes that you will make it sufficient.
So in that work question that we...
In the notes, yeah.
Oh, not the solution?
No, page 29 of the notes. Page 29 of the notes has got one with a prop halfway up.
Right.
In fact, it might be more useful if I went through that one first, actually.
Yeah, I definitely on that one. Yeah, you work out which ones.
Right, now then, there it is, look. And ZZ, as I said, is always the weak axis, hence the diagram at the top right-hand corner, top left-hand corner of page 29. And it's a 4 metre long column. Everybody got there now? Just so either, if it's bending about ZZ, the effective length is going to be 2,000. If it's bending about YY, the effective length is going to be 4,000. When I say bending, I mean buckling, sorry. Buckling, depending on which one it's buckling about. If you look at the top of the next page, page 30, I've actually worked out what the slenderness ratios are. About YY, it's got an effective length of 4,000. It's got a radius of gyration of 250 upon root 12. Does everybody know where that comes from, incidentally?
What, the RYY?
The formula for the radius of gyration.
Which must come from the second way
So
there.
it was
It's the root A over I think.
that we must do.
Is this in the notes? Page 29.
The I over A.
That's where it comes from.
Oh, I.
First year, yeah. Remember that, first year. And obviously, if you're doing it the other axis, you're talking about B instead of H. So that's where the 250 over root 12 comes from, in the notes. Okay. So at the top of page 30, I've worked out the slenderness about both axes. And about one axis it comes out at 55.43, and about the other axis it comes out at 57.74. So it's marginally more likely to buckle about the z-axis than it is about the y-axis, because it's got a bigger slenderness ratio. Then if you remember, the code says, well, we don't deal with slenderness ratios anymore, we deal with relative slenderness ratios. And it gives you a formula to relate the slenderness ratio to the relative slenderness ratio, which says that the relative slenderness ratio is the ratio that you just worked out divided by pi, I think it is.
Yeah.
Now, if you need to know that in the exam, it can be quoted. In the notes, I actually waded through this theory at some length. I can find it on page 23.
Would you dip into any of those bits that you've gone into detail? Examples or
If an exam you needed this, I would probably quote that formula for you.
and would you ask anything about the theory behind that, which you've gone
Oh,
into
no,
detail?
no, no. That's put in for two things. One, because if you're like me, I don't like using equations if I don't understand where they've come from.
Yeah.
And secondly, because that theory actually applies not merely to timber, but it applies to steel. And if you look in the steel code, it's got exactly the same Harry Robertson basis to its formula as well. So it's actually sort of universal. It's one of the problems they had when they drafted the Euro Code, that a lot of the principles are universal. And do you do what they thought they were going to do, which is set out the universal principles and then branch off into the different materials and then branch off into the different behaviours of the different materials? Or do you do what the British Code used to do, which says, here's the steel code, it tells you everything about steel, including the buckling formula. Here's the timber code, it tells you about everything about timber, including the buckling formula, and you keep duplicating information. The Europeans thought that, because they have a different, more French sort of turn of mind, that if you set out the logical first principles, and then the second order principles, and then the third order principles, you get a sort of branching tree which would make a lot more sense. It does, but what happens is that you can never find anything, because you've got to sort of find your way down this tree, whereas the British Code said, well, that's all you need to know about this material, all sorted out for you, and that's all you need to know about this one, and never mind having to sort of fiddle around. You'll have to get used to the continental way of thinking. I read a marvellous article book by a French physicist about the turn of the century, or late 19th perhaps even, called Duhem. And Duhem wrote a book on the philosophy of science, how scientists think, how do their minds work. And he came to the conclusion that the Anglo-Saxons, as he put it, had very untidy, very sloppy minds, because they seemed to just put their ideas together and get answers. Whereas the French, he said, were very logical, which the French love to think they are. They would set out the primary principles and the secondary principles and so on and so forth, and everything would follow with immaculate logic, even if it took 3 times as long. It doesn't explain why Trinity College, Cambridge has produced as many Nobel Prize winners as France. It's thought, anyway. And Duhem then went on to expand the argument, and he said, well, you can see it in everything. He said, you can see it in their music. British music is sort of sloppy and emotional and expansive. Look at Elgar and people like that. Whereas the French are very precise. I mean, look at people like Rameau and Couperin and so on. Very elegant, very sophisticated. And then he went on to literature and he said, Shakespeare's pretty hairy stuff, really. He keeps getting interested in the sort of emotions of all these people and the motivation. He said, what you need is something classical like Racine, where, in Phèdre it's all about the beauty of the language. And now, there's nothing wrong with either of these, but they are almost mutually exclusive.